Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. I was 73 when I learned that betrayal does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers in a daughter-in-law's calm voice, demanding the pension I worked for all my life, and sometimes it hides in the silence of the son you once carried in your arms. That night, the rain did not just soak my coat, it carved the truth into me. Family can turn you into a tenant in your own life, but dignity begins the moment you finally say no. Rain dripped from the edge of the porch roof, tapping against my suitcase like a metronome, keeping time with my heartbeat. I stood there, 73 years old, shoulders damp beneath a coat that had already given up the fight against the weather. The porch light had gone out minutes earlier, switched off from inside. I could picture Samantha's hand on the switch, quick and decisive, as if shutting me into the dark would make me disappear. The front door was locked tight. I had been here before in another life years ago, carrying groceries and birthday cakes, letting myself in with the spare key Michael once pressed into my palm and said was for whenever I wanted. Tonight, I was on the outside, the key useless, the welcome revoked. My suitcase felt heavier than it should have, not from what was inside, but from the weight of what had just been done. Only hours earlier, I had been sitting in the living room, the one I had dusted and vacuumed too many times to count. Samantha sat across from me, her back straight, her arms crossed, as if she were the landlord and I the tenant. Her voice was calm, sharp, rehearsed. "We are short on rent, Helen. You live here. It is time you pay or you can leave." There was no hesitation, no softening. She looked at me as if she had waited for the moment. I turned to Michael, my son, my boy, who once scraped his knee and came running into my arms. He did not look at me. He stared at the table, then gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, but clear enough. He did not defend me, did not push back, did not even clear his throat. He chose silence, and silence can cut sharper than any word. Chloe had been curled on the couch with a book. She lifted her eyes for only a second. She was 11, old enough to recognize cruelty, but too young to challenge it. Her eyes met mine, and in them I saw confusion, sorrow, maybe even shame. Then she looked back down as if her gaze itself was dangerous. That glance was the last kindness I felt in that room. I had not shouted, I had not begged. I had simply said no, quietly, evenly, with the kind of finality that comes not from anger, but from exhaustion. I thought perhaps Michael would hear the steadiness in my voice and remember who I was to him. He did not. The conversation ended not with a scream, but with the scrape of Samantha's chair against the hardwood floor as she left the room. Now I stood outside the echo of that scene, pressing on my chest, heavier than the rain. The house behind the locked door was once where I had celebrated Christmas baked pies, read bedtime stories. Tonight it was foreign territory. The windows glowed faintly from the light inside. I could hear faint voices, the hum of a television life continuing without me. I lifted my hand and knocked once. The sound was dull against the wood. No one answered. I knocked again, a little louder. Still nothing. I imagined Samantha standing in the hallway, Michael beside her, both of them waiting me out in silence. My hand dropped to my side. I could have kept knocking, could have called Michael's name, could have pleaded through the door. But I did not. The street was quiet except for the steady hiss of rain. Across the way, a neighbor's curtains shifted, then stilled. Whether they saw me or pretended not to, I could not tell. I pulled the suitcase closer to me, water sliding down the handle. My car sat at the curb, the last piece of independence I had not surrendered. Paid off years ago, still mine waiting. I stood there for another moment, letting the truth settle in. Betrayal is not always sudden. It can build slowly, brick by brick, until one day you find yourself outside in the rain with no place left in a house you once called home. Tonight the last brick was set. I walked down the steps carefully, the wood slick beneath my shoes. My knees ached with each step, but I steadied myself. The suitcase bumped along behind me, splashing through shallow puddles. At the curb, I opened the trunk and lifted the bag inside. It was lighter than it had felt on the porch, as if leaving the house had already begun to lift the weight from it. I slid into the driver's seat. The upholstery smelled faintly of the lavender sachet I had tucked beneath it years ago. I did not start the engine right away. I sat there listening to the rain drum against the windshield, watching it streak down in crooked lines. My hands rested on the steering wheel. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked older than I remembered. Wet hair clung to my face, eyes tired but dry. I thought of the casserole I had left in the refrigerator, the photographs still tucked in a drawer upstairs, the blanket I had knitted after James died. Things left behind, things that no longer belonged to me. I thought of Chloe's glance, the quick flicker of compassion before she looked away. That image warmed me even as the rest of the house grew colder in my memory. The porch light blinked once more as if someone moved near the switch. For a fleeting second, I wondered if Michael might open the door, call out, tell me to come back inside. He did not. The light stayed dark. I exhaled slowly, turned the key in the ignition, and the car came to life with a low rumble. The wipers moved across the windshield, clearing narrow paths through the rain. I gripped the wheel tighter, not out of fear, but to steady the tremor in my hands. As the car rolled away from the curb, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood silent, its windows glowing faintly, its porch slick with rain. My home once, no longer. I drove slowly through the neighborhood, past the familiar oak tree at the corner, past the gas station, where Michael used to beg for candy bars when he was a boy, past the houses that still held their porch lights steady against the storm. Each turn of the wheel carried me farther from the life I had thought would shelter me until the end. The road stretched ahead, wet and glistening, and though the rain still fell, a strange clarity settled in me. Betrayal had pushed me out, but the quiet beyond it might hold something else. I did not know what yet, but I knew I would not return to knock on that door again. I tightened my grip, eyes fixed on the road, and let the night carry me forward. I drove on through the rain until the streets began to blur, and I let my mind drift to a time when things were different, when betrayal was only something that happened to other people in stories. For 38 years, I had been a wife to James Whitmore. He was steady, the kind of man who came home smelling of sawdust and engine oil, who laughed easily and cried only once that I ever saw the day Michael was born. We built a modest life together in Eugene, Oregon. Our house was small but warm, filled with music on Sundays and the smell of his favorite pot roast on holidays. James was gone now nearly a decade. It was 2015 when his heart failed him on a September afternoon. One minute, he was leaning against the kitchen counter, telling me about the neighbor's new dog. The next, he was clutching his chest. By the time the ambulance came, the color had drained from his face. I remember holding his hand as the paramedics worked, telling him to stay to breathe. He never came back. I buried him on a cloudy morning, the same kind of sky that now pressed against my windshield as I drove away from Michael's house. Michael had been 33 then, already a man with a family of his own in trouble. His first marriage was falling apart. He called me late at night, his voice ragged, asking if I could watch Chloe, who was just 3 at the time, while he figured things out. I said yes, of course. I always said yes. I took Chloe to the park, pushed her on the swings, made macaroni with extra cheese the way she liked it. I wanted Michael to know that no matter what, home was always here. When the divorce papers came through, he was hollow-eyed and broke. I sat with him at the kitchen table, the same one where James used to spread out blueprints for his repair jobs, and told him he could move back in until he found his feet. He did, and for a while I thought maybe this was the purpose of my widowhood, to steady my son while he stumbled. It was around that time that Samantha entered our lives. She was younger than Michael by 3 years, full of energy and big ideas. She talked about opening a home decor boutique in downtown Portland, convinced she had an eye for style. Michael lit up around her in a way I had not seen in years. I wanted to believe she was the second chance he needed. I welcomed her with Sunday dinners and a cautious heart. They married quickly. I paid for the flowers and baked cookies with Chloe for the reception. I even stood up to speak, my voice shaking, telling them I believed in love that came after loss. I meant it. For a while, it seemed to work. They rented a townhouse, Chloe adjusted, and Michael seemed steadier with Samantha by his side. I let myself breathe. But small things began to appear, the kind you ignore because you want to keep the peace. I remember the first time Samantha glanced around my house while sipping coffee and asked, in an offhand way, "How much do you think this place would sell for?" She said it like she was curious about the market, as if it were nothing. I laughed, told her I had no plans to sell, that it was filled with memories. She smiled thinly and changed the subject. I brushed it aside, told myself she was just making conversation. Looking back, I see that moment for what it was, the first tug at a thread that would unravel everything, but at the time I was still blinded by hope. I wanted Michael happy. I wanted Chloe stable. I wanted family to mean what it used to mean when James was alive. So I ignored the unease. Years passed. Samantha's boutique opened and then closed within 18 months, swallowed by rent she could not cover and customers who did not come back. Michael tried to carry the load, working long hours as a sales manager for an auto parts company, but the stress wore him down. He called me one night, voice tight, asking if I could help cover Chloe's school trip expenses. I sent a check. I told myself that was what mothers did. I gave more than money. When Danny was born, I drove to Portland 3 times a week to help holding the baby through long nights so Samantha could sleep. I was proud to do it. I knitted blankets, bought groceries, paid for piano lessons when Michael said things were too tight. Each time I dipped into my savings, I heard James's voice telling me to be careful, but I pushed it aside. This was family. Then came the phone call after my fall. I had slipped on wet leaves outside my porch, fractured my ankle. I hated the cast, hated the sudden weakness. Samantha was the one who suggested I move in with them while I recovered. Michael agreed quickly. I hesitated, but Chloe begged me, her eyes shining, and I thought maybe it would be nice to have noise and life in the house again. I sold my home in Eugene and moved north with boxes and memories stacked in the back of my car. At first it felt right. Samantha made space in the guest room. Michael carried my boxes up the stairs. Danny brought me drawings of dinosaurs. Chloe curled beside me at night to read. For a while I believed I belonged, but slowly, almost invisibly, things shifted. My photo albums were tucked into the garage, my rocking chair moved to the basement. Samantha began to decide where I could keep my dishes, which towels were mine. I told myself it was just adjustment, that I was a guest and should be polite. Yet the question of money came back, little needles disguised as jokes. At dinner, Samantha once said with a laugh that I ate more than the rent I would pay anywhere else. Michael chuckled weakly, then looked down at his plate. I forced a smile, but something cold crept into me. Now, sitting alone in my car with rain streaking down the windows, I let these memories roll over me, each one carrying a weight I had ignored. The signs had been there all along. James would have seen them. He always had a way of spotting the weakness in a board before it snapped. I had refused to see. I pressed my palm against the steering wheel, feeling the rough leather beneath my skin. The road ahead was uncertain, but the past was clear. I had given, and somewhere along the line, I had stopped being mother and become resource. I had missed the warning in Samantha's eyes, the indifference in Michael's nods, the silence that grew between us. The rain slowed to a mist. I switched on the headlights and pulled forward. The night stretched open, carrying me toward whatever came next, away from the echoes of a house that had never truly been mine. The fall happened on a damp October morning in Eugene, when the maple leaves had just begun to cover the sidewalks. I was walking back from the mailbox with a handful of letters when my foot slipped on the wet ground. Pain shot through my ankle and I went down hard. A neighbor saw me and called for help, and before I knew it, I was in the emergency room with a fractured leg wrapped in plaster. The cast was heavy and awkward, and for the first time in my life, I could not manage on my own. Michael and Samantha drove down from Portland the next day. Michael fussed over me in the hospital room, adjusting the blanket, asking if the nurses were treating me well. Samantha was more direct. She told me it would be foolish to try to stay alone in Eugene with a broken leg and no one nearby to check on me. She said they had plenty of space, and it would only be temporary until I healed. I hesitated. That house in Eugene held 30 years of memories. It was where James and I had built our lives, where Michael had taken his first steps, where I had planted roses along the back fence. But when I saw Chloe holding a get well card, she had made herself and Danny clinging to Michael's leg, I felt the pull of family. I agreed to move in, telling myself it was only until I was strong again. We packed my things in boxes, and I sold the house quickly to a young couple eager to start fresh. I told myself James would understand. When I arrived in Portland, Samantha had made up the guest room with clean sheets and a vase of daisies. She smiled warmly and told me I would be comfortable. Michael carried my bags upstairs, and Chloe sat beside me on the bed, asking if I liked her drawing taped to the wall. It showed our family standing in front of their house, everyone holding hands. My heart softened. The first weeks were not so bad. Samantha cooked dinners, Michael drove me to doctor appointments, Chloe read to me before bed. Even Danny would crawl into my lap and giggle as he traced his finger along the cast. I thought maybe this was how life was supposed to circle back generations under one roof, taking care of one another. But small things began to change. My rocking chair, the one James bought me when Chloe was born, did not fit in the living room, so it was placed in the garage. My photo albums were stacked in plastic bins beside gardening tools. The Afghan I had crocheted was folded away in a box because Samantha said the colors clashed with her decor. At first I accepted these decisions as practical. I told myself it was their home and I should not disrupt their style. But each removal felt like an erasure, little by little pushing me out of the spaces where I thought I belonged. The guest room became my entire world. Samantha began to refer to it as Grandma's room, then later simply the guest room. She reorganized the closet, leaving me only a small corner for my clothes, while the rest held winter coats and boxes of Christmas decorations. I started to feel like a visitor living out of borrowed space, rather than a member of the household. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, Samantha laughed while spooning potatoes onto Michael's plate. She glanced at me and said that with how much I ate, I should probably be paying rent. Her tone was light, almost playful, but Michael chuckled softly instead of brushing it off. My fork froze midway to my mouth. I forced a smile, but inside my stomach tightened. Chloe stared at her plate, pushing peas around with her fork, and Danny giggled, not understanding the tension. Later that night, I lay awake listening to the muffled sounds of Samantha loading the dishwasher downstairs. The words echoed in my mind, dressed as a joke, but carrying weight. Rent. As if I were no longer a mother or grandmother, but a boarder. I told myself not to overreact, but the unease stayed. Weeks turned into months. My leg healed, but the balance in the house did not. I tried to help with chores, folding laundry, sweeping floors, paying for groceries, but my contributions were dismissed as either unnecessary or expected. When I bought new school supplies for Chloe, Samantha thanked me, but reminded me that she and Michael had their own system. When I baked cookies, they were eaten quickly, but no one mentioned them afterward. I began to notice the way Samantha moved through the house, efficient and decisive, deciding where everything should go, how bills should be paid, what schedule the children should follow. Michael, once strong-willed, now seemed quieter, worn down by his job search and the tension at home. He nodded more than he spoke, letting Samantha's decisions stand. One Saturday afternoon, I went into the garage to find my photo albums. They had been shifted behind stacks of plastic bins hard to reach. I pulled one out and dust rose into the air. Inside were pictures of Michael as a boy sitting on James's shoulders, grinning with missing front teeth. My throat tightened. I wondered if those memories meant more to me than they ever would to him now. That evening at dinner, Samantha brought up money again. She said the cost of living in Portland was high and joked that maybe having me around was like having a third child. Michael chuckled once more, not meeting my eyes. I forced a laugh, but something inside me twisted. Chloe looked up briefly, her eyes flickering between us, then quickly looked down again. In that moment, the truth settled in. The warmth of my arrival, the fresh sheets and daisies had faded. The comfort I thought I had found was slipping away, replaced by a subtle pressure I could not ignore. I was not family here. I was a guest tolerated as long as I did not upset the balance Samantha had built. I carried my plate to the sink and washed it slowly, listening to the sound of laughter in the living room as the children played. Water trickled over my hands, but the heaviness in my chest did not wash away. I dried the plate and set it carefully on the rack, realizing that the place I thought was safe was slowly closing in around me. I went to the guest room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. The drawing Chloe had made still hung on the wall. It showed us all together, hand in hand. But now when I looked at it, I saw the faint outline of space between the figures' gaps that had not been drawn but existed all the same. I stared at it until my eyes blurred, knowing that the comfort I once felt was no longer real. Bills began to pile up like fallen leaves no one had bothered to rake. At first I thought it was the usual cycle of life, a late phone bill here, a missed reminder there, but soon the envelopes stacked higher, and Samantha started leaving them in plain sight on the kitchen counter. The red letters stamped across the fronts made my stomach tighten. Michael had lost his job at the auto parts company when the branch downsized. He came home with a cardboard box of framed photos and a paperweight Chloe had made him in art class. He tried to smile, saying it was temporary, that he would find something else soon. But weeks passed and his search grew quieter. The computer sat open on the dining table, job postings, half-read applications half finished. He spent more time staring out the window than typing. Samantha's boutique had closed months earlier. The space in downtown Portland now sat empty, with a for lease sign the dream of stylish displays and curated decor long gone. She blamed the economy, then the location, then the customers who never appreciated her vision. I never heard her once admit that maybe it had simply not worked. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and found a spreadsheet taped to the refrigerator. It listed every expense in neat columns: rent, utilities, groceries, gas. At the bottom, written in bold letters, was contribution from Helen. Next to it, only the letters TBD. My cheeks flushed. It was not a request, it was a placeholder, a space waiting to be filled with numbers from my bank account. I tore the paper down and held it in my hand, trembling. Samantha walked in carrying a basket of laundry. She noticed the paper at once and raised an eyebrow. I asked her what this was supposed to mean. She shrugged and said it was just practical, that everyone had to pull their weight, that with Michael between jobs it only made sense. Her tone was casual, but her eyes were sharp. I said nothing. She reached over, plucked the paper from my hand, and pinned it back on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a smiling sun. That night, I sat in my room with my checkbook open, staring at the rows of numbers that had always given me comfort. I had planned, carefully saved enough to live modestly until the end of my days. James and I had worked too hard to let it sink into our fingers. This was just another storm to weather. But the seed of worry had been planted. A few days later, while buying groceries, I reached into my wallet and felt a hollow space where my pension card should have been. I searched every pocket, every corner of my purse, the glove compartment of my car. Nothing. My chest tightened with panic. That card was my lifeline. I drove home with trembling hands on the wheel. I went straight to my room and emptied my bag onto the bed. No card. My thoughts raced. Had I dropped it at the store, left it at the counter, been careless without realizing it? I hurried downstairs, my voice shaking as I asked if anyone had seen it. Michael looked up from the couch distracted and said he had not. Samantha's eyes flickered just for a moment before she said no. Later that night, while putting away dishes, I opened the drawer beside the stove, and there it was, my pension card lying neatly on top of a stack of takeout menus. My breath caught. I stood frozen, staring at it. Someone had taken it, placed it there deliberately, and left it for me to find. I picked it up, my fingers cold, my mind churning with questions I dared not ask aloud. At dinner, I set the card on the table beside my plate. I waited for someone to say something. Michael barely glanced at it. Samantha kept her eyes on the mashed potatoes she was spooning onto Danny's plate. The silence pressed heavier than words. Finally, I slipped the card back into my wallet and excused myself, claiming I was tired. Upstairs in the guest room, I locked the door for the first time since moving in. I sat on the bed, the card clutched in my hand, and listened to the muffled laughter of the children downstairs. I told myself I was imagining things, that it could have been misplaced, that suspicion was poison. But deep down, I knew. Boundaries had been crossed. The next morning, I awoke early. The house was still quiet, only the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. I went into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and saw the spreadsheet again, its columns crisp, the letters TBD glaring at me. I reached up and pulled it down once more, folded it into a small square, and slipped it into my pocket. I knew then that the life I had stepped into was not the one I had imagined when I left Eugene. The safety net had turned into a trap. What had been presented as care and comfort was revealing itself as control. My heart pounded with the weight of realization, but I kept my face calm when the family came down for breakfast. Chloe slid into her seat, her hair still tangled from sleep. She looked at me and smiled faintly before focusing on her cereal. That small gesture was enough to steady me for the moment. But as Samantha poured coffee and Michael unfolded the newspaper, I knew that the ground beneath me was shifting, and soon there would be no place left to stand. One evening, I was walking down the hallway after putting away laundry when I heard voices rising from the kitchen. The children were upstairs, and the house was otherwise quiet, so every word carried through the walls. I paused just before the doorway, not meaning to eavesdrop, but unable to step away once I realized what I was hearing. Samantha's voice was sharp, each syllable clipped. She said that keeping me there was unfair, that I had a steady pension and was giving nothing in return. She said she could not keep stretching the grocery budget and the rent while I sat by as if untouched by the storm they were facing. My chest tightened, my breath catching. Michael's response was silence at first, the kind of silence that cuts deeper than words. I could hear him shifting in his chair, the scrape of wood against tile. Samantha pressed harder. She said he was spineless if he would not speak to me directly, that any other family would have demanded help long ago. I waited for him to defend me, to remind her of the years I had given him, of the countless sacrifices made. Instead, he spoke softly, almost weary. He said maybe she was right. Maybe it was time I contributed more. The words fell like stones. I leaned against the wall, steadying myself. It was not Samantha's criticism that hurt most. It was Michael's agreement, the quiet betrayal wrapped in resignation. My own son had decided I was a burden. I backed away, careful not to make the floorboards creak, and returned to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the pale blue walls, my hands cold. My mind replayed the sound of his voice, the way he had given in so easily. For hours I could not sleep. The next morning I tried to approach him. He was in the backyard raking leaves into a pile while Danny jumped into them laughing. I stepped outside, the autumn air crisp against my face. I asked if we could talk. He paused, leaned on the rake, and nodded. I told him I had overheard part of the conversation last night. I said I understood times were hard, but I had already been helping, paying for groceries, covering Chloe's piano lessons, doing what I could. I waited for him to meet my eyes. He looked down at the ground, pushing a stray leaf with the toe of his boot. He said maybe Samantha was right, that it was not enough. His voice was flat, almost detached, as if he were talking about a stranger and not his own mother. My throat tightened. I asked him if he really believed that after everything, after the years I had carried him through his first divorce, opened my home, sold my own house to move in with them. Did he truly think I was not contributing? He shrugged, still not looking at me. He said the bills were piling up, that Samantha was stressed, and that he could not keep fighting her on everything. Then he added quietly, "Maybe she is right, Mom." The words cut deeper the second time. I stood there in the yard, the rake handle between us like a line drawn in the dirt. Danny laughed again, throwing leaves into the air, unaware of the heaviness pressing down. I turned and went back inside, my legs heavy. Chloe sat at the dining table working on homework. She looked up, sensing something in my expression, but said nothing. I managed a small smile for her before retreating to my room. All afternoon, I sat with my thoughts. The walls of the guest rooms seemed to close in tighter. I looked at the boxes of my belongings stacked neatly against the far wall, untouched since I moved in. They were reminders that nothing here was truly mine. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard Michael and Samantha's voices again, muffled through the vents. They were not shouting this time, only murmuring, but the cadence told me everything. Decisions were being made without me about me. I pulled the blanket tighter, my heart thudding. In the morning, the spreadsheet had been updated. I saw it pinned to the refrigerator again, only this time the space beside contribution from Helen was filled with a number. I stood staring at it, my breath shallow. No one mentioned it. Samantha poured coffee. Michael read the paper. The children ate their cereal. I slipped the paper into my pocket when no one was looking, my hands trembling. That day I carried an invisible weight. Every smile from the children felt bittersweet. Every word from Michael was tinged with distance. I moved through the house as though I were a ghost present, but unseen, useful, only for what I might provide. That night, lying in the dark, I finally admitted what I had resisted. Michael had chosen Samantha's side not through anger or argument, but through quiet surrender. His silence was louder than her demands. And it was that silence that told me more clearly than anything that I no longer had a place in his home. Dinner that night carried the kind of silence that makes even the clinking of silverware sound like thunder. Chloe sat across from me, pushing peas around her plate. Danny hummed softly to himself, tapping his fork against the rim of his glass. Michael kept his eyes fixed on his plate, cutting his chicken into pieces so small they seemed to vanish before he lifted them to his mouth. Samantha sat at the head of the table, her shoulders squared, her jaw set as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. I sensed it before she spoke. The tension in the air was too deliberate, too rehearsed. She set down her fork, folded her hands on the table, and looked straight at me. Her voice was firm, almost businesslike. She said they needed my entire pension check this month. Not part of it. All of it. She added that if I could not agree, then perhaps I should consider moving out. For a moment I thought I had misheard. The words sounded surreal, like a line from a play delivered too flatly to be real. I looked from her to Michael, waiting for him to react, to protest, to at least soften what she had just said. He did not. His eyes stayed down, fixed on the tablecloth, his hands motionless beside his plate. I felt the heat rise in my chest. The children froze, sensing the sharp edge in the room. Danny stopped tapping. Chloe stared at her lap. I spoke carefully, my voice quiet but steady. I asked Samantha if she understood what she was saying, that I had spent years helping them, paying for groceries, covering school supplies, babysitting, doing all the little things that kept their lives moving. She smiled faintly, not kindly, but with a kind of triumph. She said those things were not the same as paying rent. She said everyone in the house had to contribute, and I had been here long enough without doing my share. I turned again to Michael, my son, the boy I had raised through scraped knees and heartbreaks, the man who once called me in tears after his divorce, asking if he could come home for a while. He lifted his eyes briefly, just long enough for me to see the conflict there, then lowered them again. He did not speak. His silence was worse than anger. It was agreement without courage. The weight of the moment pressed against my chest. I felt the room tilt slightly, like the ground had shifted beneath me. I thought of James, my late husband, how he used to sit at the head of our own table, his laughter filling the room. He would have never allowed this. He would have defended me without hesitation. The children sat still, wide-eyed, and I realized they were watching not just their parents, but me. They were learning what family meant, what loyalty looked like. My voice dropped even lower, almost a whisper. I said no. The single word seemed to echo. Samantha's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. Michael let out a small sigh, not relief, not protest, just exhaustion. I folded my napkin, slowly placed it beside my plate, and kept my hands still on the table to stop them from trembling. No one spoke after that. Danny asked if he could be excused, and Samantha nodded curtly. Chloe slipped away quietly behind him. The three of us remained the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Samantha pushed her plate away and stood gathering dishes with sharp movements. Michael stayed seated staring at the wood grain on the table as if it held answers. I stayed a moment longer, then rose and carried my glass to the sink. My reflection in the window above it startled me. I looked older than I had the week before, Line's deeper eyes shadowed. I rinsed the glass, dried it, and set it back in the cabinet. My movements felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, like I was closing something I could never reopen. As I walked back to my room, I passed the refrigerator where the spreadsheet still hung, mocking me with its columns and numbers. My name printed there like an unpaid bill. I stopped, stared at it one last time, then turned away. In my room, I sat on the bed, the quiet pressing in on me. The word I had spoken at the table still lingered in my mind. No, it was not defiance shouted in anger. It was not desperate pleading. It was final. For years I had bent, softened, yielded. Tonight I had not. Outside my window, the streetlight flickered. A car passed its headlights sweeping across the walls. I closed my eyes and let the stillness settle. The house was no longer mine, not even in pieces. It belonged to Samantha's ambition, to Michael's silence, to a version of family that excluded me. But the word no had given me something back. Not safety, not yet, but clarity. I lay down my body heavy, my heart aching, and I whispered to myself the truth I could no longer deny. I was no longer welcome here, but I would not surrender what was mine. The following morning, the sky was gray and heavy with rain, the kind that seeps into your clothes and settles into your bones. I had gone out early to pick up a prescription at the pharmacy and stopped at the market for a few small things. By the time I turned onto Michael Street, the drizzle had thickened into a steady downpour. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I pulled into the driveway. That was when I saw them. 2 suitcases, mine sitting on the front porch. The fabric darkened with water, the handles sagging under the weight of the rain. My folded umbrella was propped against them like an afterthought, already slick and dripping. For a moment I could not move. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the rain on the windshield. I opened the car door slowly, the cold air rushing in. The sound of the rain was deafening as I walked up the steps. The suitcases looked smaller than I remembered, shrunken by the storm. I reached out and touched the fabric soaked through and felt the cold sting against my fingers. Through the living room window, I caught a glimpse of movement. Samantha passed by carrying Danny on her hip, his little head resting on her shoulder. She did not look out at me, though I knew she must have seen. A second later, Michael's figure appeared, and with one swift tug, he pulled the curtain closed. I stood frozen, the rain dripping from my hair into my eyes. I knocked once, twice, the sound muffled by the downpour. I pressed the doorbell, waited, listening for footsteps. Nothing. Only the faint sound of cartoons coming from inside and the clatter of dishes. I knocked again, louder this time, my palm flat against the wood. My voice cracked as I called Michael's name. No answer. The porch light was off, just as it had been the night before. A house that once smelled of Sunday dinners and echoed with children's laughter now stood silent against me, the door sealed like a vault. I let my hand fall to my side, the cold water running down my sleeve. The betrayal was no longer hidden in quiet words or unspoken agreements. It was written there in the rain in the suitcases waiting for me like evidence of a decision already made. I bent down, lifted one handle, and felt the weight pull against my shoulder. The suitcase was heavier than it had been when I packed it, the water making the fabric sag and the zippers strain. My wrist throbbed as I dragged it down the steps, then went back for the second. The neighbors across the street glanced up briefly, then quickly busied themselves with their own tasks. I caught the flicker of a curtain, but no one came out. The shame burned hot in my chest, hotter than the rain was cold. I opened the trunk of my car and heaved the bags inside. My breath came in short bursts, not from the effort, but from the realization pressing down on me. I had been pushed out of my daughter-in-law's house, my son's house, and they had not even given me the dignity of a goodbye. I stood there a moment longer, my hand resting on the trunk, the rain dripping from my chin. I looked once more at the window, the curtains still drawn tight. Behind it, my family moved through their day, as if I had never been part of it. The knock I had given them the chance to open the door to undo what they had done remained unanswered. That silence told me everything. They had chosen to lock the door not just to their home, but to me. I slid into the driver's seat, water dripping from my coat onto the upholstery. My hands shook as I placed them on the steering wheel. The engine hummed to life, but I sat there a long while before shifting into gear. The house loomed in the rearview mirror, the porch barely visible through the sheets of rain. The suitcases were gone now, tucked away in my trunk, but the image of them sitting abandoned would stay with me forever. When I finally drove away, the tires splashing through the puddles, I did not look back again. It was the moment I understood with painful clarity that the door had closed for good and no amount of knocking would ever open it again. I drove through the rain without a clear destination, the wipers smearing water across the glass as though they were as tired as I felt. My hands gripped the wheel until my knuckles ached. At each red light, I told myself to keep moving just one more block, just until I could breathe again. My mind kept circling back to the porch, to the sight of my belongings left out, like trash to Michael's shadow pulling the curtain closed. By the time I reached the edge of town, I knew where I needed to go. Ruthie. We had met in high school more than 50 years ago, back when we were girls with braids and notebooks full of dreams. Life had pulled us in different directions, but we always circled back. She had once told me her door would always be open. I prayed she had meant it. Her house sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees, their branches bending under the rain. The porch light glowed warmly against the gray morning. I pulled into her driveway, my tires crunching over wet gravel, and sat for a moment with the engine idling. My chest tightened, the humiliation washing over me. I was 73 years old and standing at a friend's door with nothing but soaked suitcases. Before I could knock, the front door opened. Ruthie stood there in her cardigan, her silver hair pulled back, her eyes sharp as ever. She looked at me, then at the bags in the trunk, and shook her head softly. She whispered almost to herself, "I knew it would come to this." I stepped inside, and the warmth of her home wrapped around me. The scent of peppermint tea filled the air. She guided me to the kitchen without questions, just a hand on my arm, steady and kind. She put a blanket around my shoulders, set a steaming mug in front of me, and finally sat down across from me. I tried to explain, but my voice cracked. The words tumbled out Samantha's demand, Michael's silence, the bags left on the porch. Ruthie listened without interrupting, her face calm, but her eyes fierce. When I faltered, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You don't need to justify yourself," she said. "They showed you who they are." Tears welled in my eyes, but I blinked them back. I asked what I should do now, where I should even begin. Ruthie leaned back in her chair, thoughtful. First, she said, "You need to make sure your finances are safe. Do you remember if Michael has access to any of your accounts or paperwork?" Her question cut through me like a cold wind. I remembered the months after James passed away in 2015, how overwhelmed I had felt handling the bills and legal forms. Michael had stepped in, offering to manage some of the paperwork. I had signed a few authorizations back then, telling myself it was temporary, just until I got back on my feet. The memory made my stomach turn. What if those old documents still gave him access? What if Samantha knew I looked at Ruthie, my hands trembling against the mug? I told her I had let Michael hold on to some of the paper's power of attorney forms, bank authorizations, maybe even copies of my will. At the time, it had felt like trust. Now it felt like a mistake. Ruthie's eyes sharpened. "Then that is where we start," she said firmly. "Tomorrow we go to the bank and you change everything. No one should have control but you." The weight of her words pressed against me, not frightening, but clarifying. For the first time since walking away from Michael's house, I felt a thread of direction. I nodded slowly, though my heart pounded with unease. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain against the windows. Ruthie refilled the teapot and began talking about the garden she had planted that spring, the roses that had surprised her by blooming twice. I listened, grateful for the normalcy, though my mind kept circling back to those forms, those signatures I had handed over so easily years ago. When night fell, Ruthie showed me to the spare room. It was small but warm, with a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. I set my damp suitcases by the dresser and sat down heavily. The quiet of her house was different from Michael's. It was gentle, not oppressive. Still, as I lay back against the pillow, the unease grew stronger. The image of Michael sorting through my files, the sound of Samantha's voice demanding my pension haunted me in the dark. Sleep came in fits broken by dreams of papers slipping from my hands, of locks clicking shut behind me. Each time I woke, the same thought returned, sharp and insistent. I needed to know exactly what authority Michael still held over my life. Only then would I feel safe again. When the morning light filtered through the curtains, I sat up with determination. The fear had not vanished, but Ruthie's words from the night before echoed in my mind. Start with the finances. Start with taking back control. And though my chest still ached with betrayal, there was a new ember beneath it, a quiet resolve that told me I would not let them take any more from me. The next morning, Ruthie drove me into downtown Salem, the windshield clear for the first time in days as the rain finally eased. My hands rested in my lap, folded tightly, the nervous energy running through me like a current. I stared at the bank building as it rose in front of us, tall glass windows reflecting the gray sky. Inside, the air smelled faintly of ink and carpet cleaner. A young man with kind eyes and a neat tie introduced himself as Marcus Lee. He led me into his office, offered water, and waited while I gathered the words that seemed stuck in my throat. I told him plainly that I needed every account authorization changed, every joint access revoked, every card reissued. His pen stilled over the notepad, and he asked softly if I was certain. I nodded. My voice did not shake when I said, "Yes, everything." He pulled up my file, his fingers quick on the keyboard. Page after page appeared on the screen. He explained each form, sliding them across the desk for my signature. I read each line slowly, deliberately, no longer the woman who once signed without thinking, just to ease the burden. Then he paused, his brow furrowing. He told me there had been an attempted loan application under my name a few months back, declined because the paperwork lacked proper verification. My stomach clenched. I asked who had submitted it. He said the system flagged Michael Whitmore's email as the applicant contact. The blood rushed in my ears. Ruthie, sitting beside me, stiffened. I felt both rage and a cold relief. Rage that he had tried to use me, relief that it had failed. I signed the next form with firmer strokes, each letter a small reclaiming of myself. Marcus explained that from this moment forward, only I had access. New cards would be issued, new passwords set. My accounts were clean again. From the bank, we walked a few blocks to an office with brass lettering on the glass door, Frances Darrow, attorney at law. She had been my lawyer years ago, when James passed a woman with silver hair and a sharp mind. She greeted me with a smile that softened when she saw my face. She did not ask unnecessary questions, only guided me into her office and opened a fresh folder. I explained everything. Living with Michael and Samantha, the pressure, the spreadsheet, the ultimatum, the suitcases on the porch. My voice caught when I described finding my pension card in the kitchen drawer after it had gone missing from my wallet. She listened without interruption, her pen moving swiftly across her legal pad. Then she leaned forward. "First we revoke any old powers of attorney," she said. "Then we rewrite your will. We protect Chloe directly. No parental proxy, no loopholes." I swallowed hard, grateful and afraid all at once. She drafted document after document, sliding them toward me. The language was formal, binding, powerful. When I reached the clause naming Chloe as the sole beneficiary of a trust account, tears blurred the page. Frances looked up but did not comment, simply handed me another pen when the first ran out of ink. At one point, she excused herself to check records. When she returned, she confirmed what Marcus had hinted at. Michael had once tried to use an old authorization to secure a small line of credit. It had not gone through, but the attempt remained on file. My jaw tightened, but I forced myself to keep reading, keep signing. Every stroke of my pen was a door closing behind me, sealing shut what had once been open too wide. The final document sat before me, thick with signatures and initials. Frances tapped the page gently. "This one," she said, "cuts off every authority he ever held over your finances. Once you sign, he has nothing." My hand trembled only for a moment before I steadied it. I wrote my name carefully, the loops of each letter stronger than I expected. When I lifted the pen, I felt something shift inside me. Not joy, not yet, but a deep exhale I had been holding for years. Frances gathered the papers into a neat folder embossed with my name. She told me copies would be filed immediately, the changes effective as of today. No one could touch what was mine. When we left her office, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds. I stood on the sidewalk, folder pressed to my chest, and breathed in the cool air. The ache of betrayal was still there, but layered beneath it was something new. Control. Ruthie linked her arm with mine as we walked back to the car. She did not speak, and she did not need to. I knew she understood. That night in her spare room, I spread the folder across the bed. The legal language was dense, but to me it read like freedom. I traced my finger over Chloe's name, written clearly as the future beneficiary. A trust that Samantha and Michael could never touch. My granddaughter would have something safe, something untouched by greed. I closed the folder, placed it gently on the nightstand, and sat in the quiet. The storm outside had passed, but in my chest, the thunder was only just beginning to fade. For the first time in months, I felt I had taken back the part of me they had tried so hard to erase. A week later, I signed the lease on a small one-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a brick building just outside downtown Salem. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon polish and someone's cooking from the floor below. Letitia, the building manager, met me with a wide smile and a jangling set of keys. She walked me up the narrow stairs and showed me the unit. The beige carpet was worn, the kitchen cabinets creaked when opened, but sunlight poured through the windows in the afternoon, and it was mine. Letitia handed me the keys with both hands and said I could hang wind chimes on the balcony if I wanted. Her kindness caught me off guard. I thanked her, my voice low but steady, and stepped into my own place for the first time in years. The first nights were quiet in a way I had forgotten existed. No footsteps pounding upstairs, no sharp words carried through vents. I bought a second-hand armchair from a thrift store and placed it by the window, unpacked my books, and set a photo of James on the sill. His smile in that picture seemed to steady me. 2 days after moving in, an envelope slid under my door. The handwriting was crooked but familiar. My heart tightened as I unfolded the paper. Grandma, you're my home. Love, Chloe. I pressed the letter to my chest and closed my eyes. The words were simple, but they wrapped around me like a quilt. A week later, there was a knock at the door just before noon. When I opened it, Chloe stood there with her backpack. Her eyes bright but nervous. Behind her, Janine lingered on the stairs, arms folded, saying she would return at 5. She did not step inside. I nodded and closed the door. Chloe set her bag down and looked around my little apartment. It is small, she said, but it is cozy. I smiled and told her it was enough. She grinned and asked if we could bake pie. I had already bought apples and cinnamon, hoping she would. We stood side by side at the counter rolling dough with the old wooden pin Ruthie had loaned me. Chloe laughed as Flour dusted her sleeves. She sliced the apples carefully, her tongue poking out the corner of her mouth, just like her father used to do when he was little and focused. I brushed butter over the crust while she sprinkled sugar and spice. The kitchen filled with warmth and the smell of cinnamon. When we sat at the table with slices of pie still steaming, Chloe's voice softened. She said she knew they had been wrong. She had seen the way her parents spoke to me, the way I carried the weight of the house without thanks. She looked at me with wide eyes and whispered that she was glad I chose to leave. My throat tightened. I reached across the table and held her hand, her small fingers curling into mine. I told her kindness does not mean letting people hurt you, not even family. Her eyes glistened, but she nodded with a seriousness far beyond her years. We spent the afternoon talking about school and the little things she loved. She told me about her teacher's earrings shaped like stars and how Danny still left socks in the hallway. She asked about James, and I told her stories of her grandfather's terrible singing voice and the way he used to dance in the kitchen when he thought no one was watching. Her laughter filled the room, echoing against the bare walls, making the apartment feel alive. At 4:30, her phone buzzed. She sighed and packed her bag slowly. At the door, she hugged me tightly, pressing her face against my sweater. She said she wanted to come again soon. I kissed the top of her head and told her she would always have a place here. After she left, the apartment was quiet again, but it was no longer the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of peace, layered with the faint memory of her laughter. I washed the pie plates, placed the leftover slices in the fridge, and sat by the window in my armchair. The letter she had written lay on the table, and I read it again, tracing each crooked letter with my finger. Grandma, you're my home. The words anchored me. They reminded me that even if the door to Michael's house had closed, another had opened, one filled with warmth and truth. As the evening light faded, I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and listened to the faint hum of the city outside. For the first time in a long time, I felt steady. The betrayal still hurt, but Chloe's words had planted something stronger in me, something that told me I was not alone. The weeks that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. I walked to the market on Saturdays, brewed tea in the afternoons, and met Ruthie for church on Sundays. It was a life stripped down to simple comforts, yet I felt lighter than I had in years. Still, the small town never let stories stay hidden. Whispers reached me before long, carried on neighbors' tongues like autumn leaves in the wind. People had seen my suitcases on the porch. They talked about how I had been left in the rain, how Samantha barely looked at me as Michael pulled the curtain closed. Some looked at me with pity in the grocery store, others with outrage. None of it surprised me. In places like ours, truth finds its way out. Samantha's circle of friends began to shrink. She had once hosted gatherings filled with talk of her decor projects, but now fewer cars lined her driveway. I overheard women in the bakery whisper that her latest design job had fallen apart when she missed deadlines and demanded extra payments. One shook her head and said she had always been too hungry for money. At the same time, envelopes began arriving at their house with bold red letters across the front. A friend of Ruthie's who lived 2 streets over mentioned seeing the bank truck parked outside. Word spread that late notices had turned into foreclosure threats. I listened not with glee, but with a strange calm. What had been done to me was not mine to avenge. Life had a way of returning what was owed. One afternoon, my phone rang. Michael's name lit up the screen. For a moment, my hand froze, the weight of years pressing into that one call. I answered, my voice steady. His tone was strained, the edges fraying. He said they were in trouble, that the mortgage was behind, that Samantha's projects had failed, that he did not know what to do. He asked if I could lend him something, anything, just for a little while. He said the children needed stability, that Chloe and Danny should not have to see the house slip away. I closed my eyes and listened. His words tumbled like they used to when he was small, when scraped knees and broken toys had brought him running to me. But this was not the same. The man on the line was no longer my boy in need of comfort. He was the one who had stood silent as I was pushed out into the rain. I took a slow breath and told him gently but firmly that not everyone is given another chance after betrayal. He was silent on the other hand. He might argue, might plead louder. Instead, it was only his unconditional and a hollow thank you, and the line clicked dead. I set the phone on the table, poured myself another cup of tea, and sat back in my chair. The steam curled upward, soft and fragrant, wrapping around me like a shield. My hands no longer shook. I felt an unexpected lightness, as if the weight of his needs had rolled off my shoulders for the last time. Outside the window, the trees had begun to turn their leaves edged with amber and gold. Children laughed somewhere down the block, their voices carrying in the crisp air. I held the warm cup between my palms and let the quiet fill me. For the first time in months, maybe years, I was not waiting for someone else to decide my worth. The door that had closed behind me had made space for peace. And as I sipped the tea, I understood that sometimes justice does not arrive with noise or fury. Sometimes it comes quietly in the form of a phone call ended and a heart finally at rest. Sometimes it comes quietly in the form of a phone call ended and a heart finally at rest. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds in pale gold stripes, softening the edges of the small apartment. I brewed a pot of chamomile and settled by the window when a large envelope slid under my door. The return address read, Francis Darrow, and I knew before opening it what it would be. My hands shook slightly as I tore it open. Inside was the official confirmation that the trust fund for Chloe was complete. Her future was protected, sealed in law, untouchable by the ones who had tried to take from me. I sat for a long time, staring at the stamped seal, the sharp ink of my own name on the documents. A wave of peace washed over me. The fear that had lived in my chest for months began to loosen its grip. That afternoon, another envelope arrived, this one smaller, decorated with stickers of stars and hearts. Chloe's handwriting curved across the front. I unfolded the paper and found a drawing of a small brick apartment with a balcony and flowers in the window. At the bottom, she had written in crooked letters, Grandma's house. In the corner, she had scribbled, "Do you want tea?" Tears blurred my vision. I set the drawing on the table and traced her words with my finger. She had seen me not as the woman her parents had dismissed, but as home. When she visited the following weekend, we brewed tea together just as she had written. We sat at my little table, steam rising between us, the scent of sugar cookies baking in the oven. She leaned against me, warm and safe, and for the first time, I felt the fullness of what had been returned to me. The whispers in town about Michael and Samantha continued. More notices arrived at their house, and neighbors shook their heads at the way things had unfolded. But I no longer carried that weight. Their choices were theirs to live with. I had chosen something different. As Chloe colored at the table, I stood at the window with my cup and breathed deeply. The world outside was ordinary cars passing, birds hopping along the branches, but inside my chest the calm felt extraordinary. Justice had not arrived with thunder or shouting. It had arrived in papers signed in freedom, regained in the laughter of my granddaughter, filling a room they could never touch. I placed Chloe's drawing in a frame on the wall above my chair. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded that home is not built by walls or by those who would shut you out. Home is found in love, in dignity, in the quiet courage to protect what is right.